So, Alexander, you will conduct a seminar on process and event, and now in February the 7th. And I wanted to ask you, so what is thematically, the relationship between process and event and the other books of the two trilogies that you wrote, especially Digital Libido?
Well, John Söderqvist and I wanted to do a really profound work on the relationship between human beings and technology. We think this was the big issue in the 20th century that philosophy completely ignored, and it had to be done. And I think it's obvious now with the internet revolution, with AI around the corner, that this is a seriously interesting question. What we then did was that we followed Hegel's advice and first wrote a book on the future. Then we wrote a book on the predicament with the current. And finally, to top it all off, we rewrote all of human history until now. And the point here is that the easiest thing to do is to write the book on the future. It's harder to nail really what's going on in the times you actually live in. And it's really, really hard to read out all of history, to make sense of it for us today. And this is why Syntheism and Digital Libido came out first. And that's also why Process and Event is the final book to top it all off, the big tome from John Söderqvist and me.
Fantastic. So what is the main idea, the core idea of process and event? It's like when we want to go unfold this within the seminar, what is the basic information, the basic idea that's unpacked or packed in there?
Well, besides exploring technology and our relationship to technology, Söderqvist and I have always united East and West. We thought it would be embarrassing to be a 21st century philosopher and start with the Greeks again. Sloterdijk was probably the last philosopher ever to start with the Greeks. It's now embarrassing. We can't do that. We have to include India, China, Japan, Africa, even other cultures as well in our perspective. So Process and Event starts with the idea that long before the Greeks, the really interesting division happened during the Bronze Age between India and Persia. And India stayed with the concept of process as the most fundamental concept for philosophy, whereas the Persians tried to see if event instead could be the first primary concept of philosophy. And essentially what we call the East stayed with process, and what we call the West today, from the Persians to the Greeks, onwards to Egyptians and Romans, and onwards to Westerners today, we have stayed with eventology, the concept of event. So the entire history of philosophy was formulated already in the Bronze Age as the conflict, the creative conflict between process and event. And of course, both are right. You can look at the world as nothing but processes. But if you ever dream about something happening that could take history in a whole new direction, you have to think event. And this is what the West is all about. So the title of the book sums it up. We are going down to the very, very basics of what philosophy fundamentally is. And it's this history of the dialectical relationship between the process and the event. And then we go from ancient Persia 4,000 years ago forward and say what was developed during the Bronze Age was far more interesting than what came afterwards. The Axial Age is overrated. Our enemies are Plato and Confucius. So we are really with Heraclitus and with Nietzsche in his critique of Plato, pro-Heraclitus in our work.
Fantastic. So you mentioned history, and it's for me reading that book, it's not only that there's this history of processes and events and how that unfolded in history, but also, like, let's say metaphysical architecture, you know, how our world is structured. And also what you do in the book, you show how that plays out in our daily life, these two kind of phenomena, let's say. And so what your book does, it aligns all these different layers perfectly. And so the question is, so what if you attend, if somebody reads the book or attends the seminar, what is it? How can somebody recognize that in their own lives, these two phenomena, this process?
Well, the thing is that I have always subscribed to the idea that Hegel and Nietzsche should be united. Hegel and Nietzsche are doing two different things, but it's all about the same thing at the end of the day. Because with Hegel and Nietzsche, the philosophy of time arrived in the West. Before that, it was all a philosophy of place. But after Hegel and Nietzsche, it's all about time, and it's all happening along the time axis. And time is the one thing that's the hardest thing to think. So we start by thinking through time properly, following from Hegel and Nietzsche and onwards. And then we take time philosophy of the East and includes that as well. And then we move forward. And then we go into the concept of the tribe. Human beings are social creatures. We're flock animals, even if we're honest about it. So everything for human beings is about being tribal. And what does it mean to be tribal? And what does it mean to lead a tribe? What kind of leadership is there in tribe? And then we go into developing a full archetypology of what it means to lead the tribe, what it means to be old and wise, what it means to be young and energetic, and how old and young are supportive of each other, how man and woman are supportive of each other. And suddenly you realize that we're actually basically creating this sort of tribal society that makes sense. And it turns out we can then prove that this tribal society was developed and came with Homo sapiens 40,000 years ago, conquered the planet, and we're still living within that mentality. So the problem today, when everything has gone global through technology, is that we are still very local as human beings. And here's where we lay out the process anyway. We lay out the locality of the human mind versus the globality, I would say, of technology. The technology goes towards a global empire. We human beings don't even get that, but that's where technology is moving, whereas we will go more local and more tribal than ever. And that is what we must understand now quickly.
Right. Isn't it also about, to be able to negotiate when the individual is kind of engulfed in, repetitious behavior, in all these things in which we are embedded in, but then to find ways to exit, these kind of things, create new behaviors, create new ideas, new perspectives, and to negotiate these two forces that we're wrestling with.
Exactly. And here's the point. We are and we were always nomadic. And then we started creating permanent settlements some 5,000 to 10,000 years ago. And finally, after the Chinese invented gunpowder could stop the Mongols, the permanent settlement became the ideal of what it means to be human. But we are still these nomadic creatures. But we can't talk about movement today as if it was nomadic, because we are settled, we find places to live, we make a living, we have geographical locations we get attached to and things like that. Rather, the movement that's interesting today is along the time axis. We call that exodology. The Exodus in the Bible. What does it mean to be the new? What does it mean to sit in Egypt to realize that, oh my God, we have this great new idea. We are the event. Egypt is the process, but we are the event. What does it mean to be the event and leave Egypt and go to the promised land to establish a new paradigm? What does it mean to dare to think a new historical paradigm? What does it mean, for example, to think the true potentiality of the internet? What does it mean to think the true potentiality of AI? And what does it mean to personify that, to be the new elite? And that's what we've always written about. And here's the point. By doing exodology, as a form of migration where you move from one place to another place in time, rather than nomadology where you move from one place to the next only to survive and find something to eat. We can go into the nomadic mentality we have and get excited about it, but we're actually moving from an old paradigm to a new paradigm.